Is the Genesis 1 creation account the backdrop to Paul's words in Romans 1? Spoiler alert, it's probably not. Hi, my name is Dr. Jordan Koss, and this is the Millennial Harbinger channel. Now, many evangelical apologists and evangelical, perhaps teachers, would say that, hey, when you're trying to understand what Paul is saying, in Romans 1, when he's talking about homosexual relationships and homosexual same-sex sexual relations there, then Paul's foundational argument is based upon Genesis chapter 1 and 2, the creation account or creation accounts. Examples of that are, Josh McDowell and Rebecca McLaughlin in her recent book. And they're not necessarily wrong. You could say every passage after Genesis 1 and 2 is based upon the creation account. So across the board. But what is Paul's specific backdrop to what he has to say there in Romans chapter 1, verses 18 and following? My argument is that it's not Genesis 1. My argument is that it is not Genesis 1 and 2, okay? But rather, it is what's referred to as the divine counsel worldview. Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9 describes how Yahweh's dispersal of the nations at Babel resulted in his disinheriting of those nations as his people. This is the Old Testament equivalent of Romans 1, 18 through 25, a familiar passage wherein God gave humankind over to their persistent rebellion. Here, Dr. Michael Heiser, in his book Unseen Realm, discusses how Romans 1, 18 through 25 is kind of like the place to go to if you want to see what he calls the Deuteronomy 32 worldview at play. And when I first read this was like one of those aha moments, like, interesting, I'm going to look into that. And when you look into it, man, you find some cool things. Now, Heiser's divine counsel worldview is based on four main texts: Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9, Deuteronomy 4, 15 and 19, Psalm 82, 1 through 8, and Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel story. All right. Now, on top of these four main passages, Heiser talks about in Unseen Realm and further Deuteronomy 32 worldview, how the prologue has three main rebellions, not just one that we can think of, right? The first one in Genesis 3 is oftentimes all you hear about in church, and how the problem of humanity is sin, choosing to do what not God's will, rather than choosing to do God's will in the garden. But Heiser accentuates and highlights what, more likely than not, first century Jews were thinking, and how they understood the prologue, and how they read Genesis 6 and how they read Genesis 11, and how all three together relate the problem that we face here in this fallen world. And it's not just human sinfulness, but it's that, and it's also the sins of the watchers in Genesis 6 and all that resulted from that, the consequences that resulted from that. Okay. And so it kind of looks like this. If there's a way of putting this on paper, a visual, I've used this before in classes that I've taught. And so you have in the top right corner, Yahweh the Most High. He is the Elohim of Elohims. And he's not the only Elohim, but he is the Most High of the Elohim. And the other Elohim, referred to in the top left corner, the sons of God, using that phrase from Genesis 6, they're created heavenly beings, imagers in the heavenly realm serving Yahweh. And when Genesis 11 happened, he divorced the nations and set sons of God or heavenly beings over them to rule over them, which in his purpose was hopefully in a righteous way. Problem was, those sons of God rebelled, as Psalm 82 discloses to us. But the whole storyline moving forward post Genesis 11 is basically this: Yahweh the Most High trying to use Abram and the people that come from him, and ultimately Jesus, to lead the nations back to himself. But the problem and the conflict from Genesis 12 and following is that the sons of God are like, nah, we don't want to do that. We are actually going to use the nations to try to lead God's own people to worship us. and get the nations and God's own people to worship us and commit idolatry and not worship Yahweh the Most High. I call this the Deuteronomy 32 worldview quadrant. I don't know if this is any good, but this is how I've often portrayed it to those I've taught. Okay, and so instead of Genesis 1 being the backdrop to Romans 1, I would say it's Deuteronomy chapter 4, one of the main 4 passages of Heiser's Deuteronomy 32 worldview. In Romans 1:23, Paul says, they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles. Great. Now, in Romans 1:23, some commentators might say, and other evangelical voices might say, you know what? I think that's Genesis 1 there that Paul's quoting. But some more astute commentators and writers and theologians notice that Paul is not quoting and referencing the Greek, the Septuagint of Genesis 1, but rather he's quoting and referencing the Greek of Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 15 through 19, because the very verbiage and order that Paul uses here is modeled after Deuteronomy 4 and not Genesis chapter 1 or 2. Okay, so that is a very important observation. Here's Deuteronomy 4, 15 through 19. In English, you saw no form of any kind the day the Lord spoke to you at Horeb out of the fire. Therefore, watch yourselves very carefully so that you do not become corrupt and make for yourselves an idol, an image of any shape, whether formed like a man or a woman, or like any animal on earth, or any bird that flies in the air, or like any creature that moves along the ground, or any fish in the waters below. Now, that's not the whole passage, but it goes on to talk about not worshiping also the sun, moon, and stars, which serve as a symbol for spiritual beings ever since Genesis 1, right? So he's basically saying, hey, don't commit idolatry. Do not become corrupt and worship images of what Paul referred to as, these, once again, moral human beings, birds, animals, and reptiles. But what's also interesting in Romans 1:23 is that not only in the second half does he reference and quote Deuteronomy 4 from the Septuagint, but he's also referencing several passages in the Hebrew Bible, in the Septuagint, related to this term exchanged. The first half of Romans 1:23, which says again, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God. Where does Paul get this terminology from? Well, he gets this terminology from Psalm 106, verses 19 through 20, which say, at Horeb, they made a calf and worshipped an idol cast from metal. They exchanged their glorious God for an image of a bull which eats grass. And this psalm is talking about Israel's failures, and it's highlighting here in these verses Israel's failure at Sinai, when they committed idolatry by making the calf at Horeb or Mount Sinai. And the terminology used to describe that idolatry is exchanging the glory of God, the glory of the Most High, the glory of Yahweh, for the glory of another God, referred to as the image of a bull which eats grass. And you see that terminology used throughout the Hebrew Bible in reference to worshiping idols. The image of a bull which eats grass is used multiple times. But not only is it Psalm 106 a passage that Paul's referencing using that exchange terminology, he's also referencing, let's say, Deuteronomy 2 not Deuteronomy 2, but Jeremiah 2, verse 11. Whether Paul is intentionally referencing Jeremiah 2 or Jeremiah 2 just using that same terminology, I don't think it matters, but I think it's significant here that Jeremiah 2:11 is also talking about the same thing and using the same verbiage that Psalm 106 is and that Romans 1 is. Jeremiah 2:11 says, has a nation changed its gods, even though they are no gods? But my people have changed their glory for that which does not profit. Okay, so the same thing is going on here. Changing or exchanging gods even though they are no gods, which means not that, no, those gods really don't even exist. They're not real gods. It means they're not the God of gods. They're not the creator. They're not the most high. Yahweh is the Elohim of Elohims, as Heiser often discussed when he was still with us. But my people have changed their glory. Changing glory is an idiom for worshiping a different God, exchanging gods, if you will, and a God that does not profit, because that God that they've exchanged worship and glory for, it has their ill at heart and not their profit, not their good, not their salvation. Okay. And so not only does this exchange terminology that Paul uses in Romans 1 hint at the backdrop to Romans 1, his words there in Romans 1, 18 through 2:11, but this other terminology that we find later on in Romans 1 is also important to observe, and because this terminology is very, very significant to get to the heart of what Paul's trying to say in Romans 1, especially when you're talking about, hey, what's the backdrop? Is it Genesis 1 or not? But in the handed over terminology is found in Psalm 106 and Jeremiah 2 as well, on top of the exchange terminology. In Psalm 106, it says, he gave them into the hands of the nations, and their foes ruled over them. To be given into the hands of the nations is kind of a synonymous thought with being given over into the hands of the gods of those nations as well, the sons of God that rule over them that have rebelled, thinking in terms of the Deuteronomy 32 worldview once again. And then in Jeremiah 2, this word is used as well in reference to idolatry, where Jeremiah 2, later on in that chapter, this says, a wild donkey accustomed to the desert, sniffing in the wind in her craving. In her heat, who can restrain her? Any males that pursue her need not tire themselves. At mating time, they will find her. So Jeremiah is prophetically laying the smackdown on Israel, describing Israel like a female donkey in heat, wildly looking for a male to procreate with. And this metaphor is in reference to Israel's pursuit of gods and pursuit of idolatry to worship, right? Not a very positive metaphor to describe Israel. This is Israel. This is what Israel does continually throughout their history, starting at Sinai. All right, so the exchange terminology and handed over terminology is found both in Psalm 106 and Jeremiah 2 and Romans 1. Okay, so here we go. This is, I'm highlighting that again. Psalm 106, exchange handed over. Jeremiah 2, exchange handed over. And then in Romans 1, we find these two terms used three times. First, exchange is found in Romans 1:23, and then handed over in 1:24, exchanged in 1:25, handed over in 1:26a, exchanged in 1:26b, handed over in 1:28. And so the fact that Paul uses these two terms three times is something that one commentator in particular has made note of, and that commentator is Beverly Gaventa. She just wrote a new Romans commentary in the New Testament library, and here's a quote that she makes about handed over being used three times. She says, the repetition of the phrase God handed them over marks it as crucial to the passage, perhaps even to the whole letter. Paul repeats this verb three times, in each case with God as the subject. And this signals a major concern of the letter. All right, so Beverly Gaventa realizes the significance of Paul using these terms, especially the handed over term, three times. She doesn't comment upon exchange being used three times as much as she does this idea of being handed over. Okay, so if you're wondering, is this legit or not, about, hey, does Deuteronomy 4 and Psalm 106 really form the backdrop to Paul's words in Romans 1:18 through 2:11 more so than Genesis 1, then perhaps look at this guy's dissertation He wrote Romans 1:18 through 2:11, and the substructure of Psalm 106, 105 in the Septuagint, evocations of the calf. He wrote a whole dissertation on this. And where did he write it? I forget. Loyola University of Chicago. He wrote this and published and finished this in 2012. So I'm not just making this up about Psalm 106, Jeremiah 2, Deuteronomy 4, being more so of the backdrop in Romans 1 than Genesis 1. Okay, so you can check that out. I think you can download that for free online, I believe, and happy reading, because that's a long one. Now, so basically here, I want to sum it up like this. The backdrop of Romans 1 is not Genesis 1, but rather Psalm 106, Deuteronomy 4, Jeremiah 2, or what Heiser calls the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. Okay, the backdrop of Romans 1, that is the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, is predominantly seen in the thrice repeated duo terms exchanged, handed over, and the quotation of Deuteronomy 4. And this exchange handed over terminology is very significant, because who are they handed over to? Well, I've made other videos discussing this on the channel, and handed over is in reference to being handed over to those very rebel spiritual beings that Jesus frees us from that slavery to them by himself. Later on in Romans, it discusses how Jesus handed himself over to them, implying to them, so that he could free us from the slavery to them, right? So Deuteronomy 32 worldview, I argue, is more so the backdrop to Romans 1 than so let's say Genesis 1. Even though you could say Genesis 1 is a backdrop to every passage since Genesis 1 and 2. Okay. Now I want to go back to Brett Provence's argument that I started discussing in the last video, in the previous episode. All right. Here's what Provence argues. And I want to discuss what his argument based upon what I just discussed. Of the Deuteronomy 32 being the worldview, being the backdrop to Romans 1, and not, let's say, Genesis 1 or something else. He says this paper argues that Paul, in fact, is referencing a supernatural catastrophe and the destruction of a city, for Romans 1:26 and 27 is an apocalyptic recollection motif involving the antediluvian world and the flood on the one hand, and Sodom and its destruction on the other, or to say Genesis 6 and 19 form the backdrop to understand Romans 1:26 and 27 better. Okay? And that's from his article, Romans 1:26 and 27 in its rhetorical tradition, which you can also find online for free. Okay, so what is he getting at? So here's Romans 1:26 and 27. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. So Provence's argument is, in honing in on these two verses, is saying, what's the identity of these men and women? He's writing from an affirming perspective, and he's making an affirming argument to say, hey, the non-affirming view is actually wrong, because what Paul is referencing are the Genesis 6 and 19 stories, rather than saying, he's not referring to actual homosexual people in Romans 1. And so that's the issue at hand. And so how do we understand and judge Provence's argument in light of perhaps the better backdrop to Romans 1 instead of Genesis 1? Well, here are the foundational texts to his argument. Okay, so the foundational texts are these three. Genesis 6, the story of the Watchers, the sons of God and human women who procreate, have hybrid offspring called the Nephilim, of which, later on in the story, Goliath is one of the descendants of, and that's the significance of the significance of the story, that David kills Goliath, much like Joshua killed the descendants of the Nephilim on the west side of the Jordan, whereas before him, Moses wiped out those descendants of the Nephilim on the east side of the Jordan. But Genesis 6, 1 through 4, and Genesis 19, the Watcher story and the Sodom and Gomorrah story, but also how the Watcher story is picked up and expanded in the book of First Enoch. Okay? And so in the rest of the article, he talks about now and tries to prove his argument by citing all of these comparative passages involving this dual judgment topos, passages that reference the Sodom and Gomorrah story and the Watcher's story, where they're paired together. Okay, it's a really intriguing argument, and I love how what he does there in showing the significance of how much these two past stories are paired together after in let's say in the New Testament and in intertestamental literature as well. So the list is this: he argues Romans 1, which is up for debate. Jude does, and Second Peter does. Yeah, that there's no argument there. They're also paired in Luke 17, Matthew 24, when in Jesus' words there. The book of Sirach 16, Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 10, Third Maccabees, the book of Jubilees, the Testament of Naphtali, and the Wisdom of Solomon, once again in 12 through 14, which a lot of people argue is what Paul's building off of in Romans 1 as well. Okay. I'm going to save that for another video in terms of Wisdom of Solomon. And so I'm not going to say anything else on that right now. But is Provence right? Like, is the identity of the men and women garnered from the stories of Genesis 6 and 19? And therefore, we cannot use these references, the men and women, as Paul saying same-sex sexual relationships for all time are not sinful. What do we think? Well, Provence's argument is kind of based upon the assumption that both the flood story and the Sodom story have nothing to say theologically about same-sex sexual behavior. His argument is like, hey, these men and women are actually the women of Genesis 6, and the men are the men of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19. And because that's their identity, then we can't say Paul is non-affirming. We must then say Paul is actually affirming, because he's not making a pronouncement of judgment upon same-sex sexual behavior for all time. But that's assuming that Genesis 6 and 19 have nothing to say about homosexual behavior, same-sex sexual behavior. And that's assuming that they don't form the foundation for sexual ethics in the Torah and in the New Testament. Okay? It's based on that assumption, and I think that assumption is wrong. I also think that the identity of the men and women has more to do with what I said at the beginning of this video. It has more to do with the exchanged handed over duo that we find 3 times in Romans 1, i.e., it's the identity of the men and women are the men and women of the nations and or Israel. Because Paul, in the first part of his argument in Romans 1, 18 through 32, is talking about all humanity, but he's also talking about Israel based upon the passages he's using, such as Jeremiah 2, Deuteronomy 4, Psalm 106. So he's grouping everybody together, Israel and humanity together, and that's who he's referencing, I believe, in Romans 1, 26 and 27. I don't think he's honing in on the Genesis 6 and 19 stories, but that's just where I'm at right now. I could change my mind, but I still think that what Paul is saying in Romans 1 is, in essence, a non-affirming argument. He's saying homosexual behavior is sinful. And my argument is the identity of the men and women has more to do with the exchange handed over duo rather than the flood Sodom dual topos. That is Provence's argument. Okay. And so here's a couple final thoughts. I think that just like affirming believers need to get on the same argumentative page in terms of how are they going to go about reading Romans 1 to make their affirming argument and interpretation. Perhaps they need to get on the same page, because many different affirming theologians, writers, speakers make, I think, arguments that counter one another. All right. But just like affirming believers need to get on the same argumentative page, so do non-affirming orthodox believers need to get on the same page with the backdrop of Romans 1 and how we go about saying, hey, here's what Paul's argument is in Romans 1, and here's the backdrop, and here's what Paul's actually saying, and the reasoning why same-sex sexual behavior is sinful. Okay? We need to get on the same page. Everybody does. And one final thought. By making this affirming argument, Provence ironically cancels out other affirming arguments as to the identity of the men and women and their specific behavior. If Provence is right here, let's just say, then all the other affirming arguments that differ from him about the identity of the men and women are wrong. And so, ironically, they kind of cancel each other out. If he's right, I don't think he is, but I think one great thing that Provence does is he reveals more of that background and that backdrop that is found within Romans chapter 1 that does include Genesis 6 and 19. It's just that I don't think that the specific identity of the men and women can be found by looking at those two stories, even though his argument is very, very intriguing. And so what I think we need to start seeing is Orthodox historical theologians and Christians, in terms of orthodoxy and sexual ethics and how and reading Romans 1, we need to see more people who make the argument about why same-sex sexual behavior is wrong by referencing the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, by referencing the exchanged handed over terminology, by referencing and seeing and observing and noting Paul's use of those Old Testament passages of Psalm 106, Jeremiah 2, Deuteronomy 4, and not just Genesis 1, because the specific backdrop is not Genesis 1 and Romans 1. All right, you can make arguments that there's certain terminology that's found in Genesis 1, yes, but perhaps the more accurate or more specific backdrop is the Deuteronomy 32 worldview and not Genesis 1. Okay, guys, so thank you for watching this video. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you gained a lot of knowledge that you didn't have before. And thank you for watching all the way to the end, and we will see you in the next episode. Goodbye.